Hey, so this is segment 1 for chapter 6, sensory system principles. The world provides many cues for what's going on around us. Natural selection has improved our senses. Sensation is the process by which the nervous system detects the physical events around us or inside us. Perception is the experience we have as we process, interpret information from sensory cells, and percept is the final interpretation of a stimulus. Sensation begins with the stimulus. A stimulus is any physical event that affects a sensory receptor cell. There are different stimuli for different senses. Sensory receptor cells are specialized sensory cells that detect stimuli. A sensory receptor organ is a clump of receptor cells all detecting a particular kind of stimulus. Audition is the official process of hearing, as well as olfaction is the process of smelling. Sensory modalities are the different types of senses: vision, hearing, taste, touch, smell. Adequate stimulus is the type of stimulus for which a given sensory receptor organ is particularly adapted. The vestibular system gives us a sense of our balance, and proprioception is the information from sensory cells throughout muscle and skin reporting on position and movement of our body. So it's basically how we know where our hands and feet are if we're not physically looking at them. All neurons send action potentials to the brain, not different types of energy. So basically the brain interprets these action potentials differently depending on what part of the body they come from. However, each action potential is the same. Labeled lines is the concept that specific nerves are indicated on to relaying specific types of sensory information to the brain. All detections have thresholds. The sensory code is the relationship between stimuli and the action potentials they produce in sensory cells. The stronger the stimulus is, the more action potentials will be produced. Threshold is the weakest possible stimulus that still affects the sensory cells firing. We can detect weak stimuli with some receptors and strong stimuli with others. So basically, all stimuli are not going to be the same, and depending on the receptor, we can either detect weak or small ones. Psychophysics systematically analyzes perception, and psychophysics is the study of how physical events such as lights and sounds affect our senses. When presented with weak stimuli, there comes a point when subjects can no longer detect the stimulus, and when they actually can. Absolute threshold is the lowest intensity of a stimulus that can be detected half the time. The just noticeable difference, or JND, is also called the difference threshold. It's the smallest change in magnitude of a stimulus that can be detected. Weber's fraction work with the smallest change, and it is the smallest change in magnitude of a stimulus that can be detected, expressed as a proportion of the original stimulus. So it's basically the JND expressed as a proportion of the original stimulus. Detection involves finding a signal in a background of noise. A false alarm is when the sensory cells that a stimuli hit it when in fact there was no stimulus. Noise is basically a false alarm. It's the firing of a sensory cell without a stimulus or to an irrelevant stimulus. Signal detection theory is a way to measure how well a real stimulus, a signal, is detected in the midst of an irrelevant stimuli. Noise. Our brains actively screen sensory input and determine whether each input is a signal or not. A hit is when we detect a real signal, or a correct rejection is when we ignore unimportant noise. Two ways to miss them are, a miss, that's ignoring true signals, and false alarms are thinking a signal is present when there is not. Sometimes having a miss or a false alarm is not always a bad thing. Instead, it can be a precaution. For example, if you're screening for breast cancer and you think you may see a tumor, it's better to have a false alarm than to have a miss and missing a tumor. The brain, as we just said, may shift criterion for whether the stimulus is noise or a signal depending on which mistake is worse, false alarm or miss. No matter where we set our criterion, we will make mistakes. It's inevitable. A stimulus that doesn't change is unimportant, so sensory systems ignore them. Sensory adaptation is the progressive loss of responsiveness in sensory cells exposed to a constant stimulant. Touch and pain. Our nerves provide information about a specific type of stimulus. Touch perception is very refined. Different receptor cells have different receptive fields, and a receptive field is the region of space where stimuli affect the activity of a cell in a sensory system. And that is the end of segment 1.